13 Nights, a quiet farmhouse in Maine, and something large, silent, and watching from the trees. No tracks, no answers, no official explanation. A family locked themselves inside as unknown creatures moved closer, night after night, stopping just yards from their door. Calls were logged, records were filed. Then everything went quiet. What followed was erased, archived, and left unexplained, and the questions never stopped. The lights beyond Madawaska Road. In 2005, Eric Martin stopped working at a paper mill after a back injury that limited his mobility and left him in chronic pain. His wife, Shelley Martin, took a job that required a longer commute, and the family began looking for somewhere closer to her route. Their daughter, Chelsea, was still in school, and they tried to avoid changing her schedule mid-year. A rental farmhouse in Palmyra, Maine, became the workable choice. The home sat off Madawaska Road on open land with a field running toward a thick tree line, and Pittsfield was only a few miles south. The first months were ordinary in the way rural life tends to be when nothing unusual happens. Shelley drove to work and kept a steady routine. Eric stayed home and managed the limits of his injury, keeping an eye on the property and the dogs. Chelsea went through her days with the same school rhythm she had before the move. 2 family dogs moved between the yard and the house, and their presence usually gave the place a constant background sound. The Martins fell into a quiet evening habit. Eric and Shelley would sit on the porch with decaf coffee and a radio turned low, looking out over the field and listening more than talking. One night, from that porch, Shelley noticed a light in the woods beyond the field. She later described it as a pulsing glow that brightened and dimmed in place, not steady like a fixed lamp and not sweeping like car headlights. Eric watched the same spot for several minutes. He called his adult son, Sean Martin, and asked him to come over and look. Sean arrived and stood with them on the porch. He said the light seemed small and distant at first, like something no bigger than a flashlight beam. As they kept watching, he reported that the light appeared to shift position and change intensity, moving in a way that did not match anything he expected from a vehicle, a neighbor, or a farm tool. Eric and Sean walked out toward the tree line with handheld flashlights. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the pulsing light was gone. The trees were close enough to block the view back toward the house, and the ground under them was uneven with brush. Eric later said he felt watched while standing there, a sudden and heavy attention he could not explain. Sean recalled that they turned their flashlights back on and looked for tracks near the edge of the field, checking the soil and the broken vegetation where someone might have walked. They did not find clear prints they were willing to identify. After a short search, the 2 men returned to the house without locating the source of the light. A separate detail from the same woods came later, in daylight, during a walk taken by Chelsea and her boyfriend, Nate. The dogs pulled harder than usual, following a scent deeper between the trees. Nate later described the animals as locked on to something specific, guiding them away from the normal path. He said they were led to a round opening in the ground, partially covered with brush. In his description, the shape looked unusually clean and circular, more deliberate than a shallow animal scrape. Chelsea kept the dogs back from it. The 2 of them left without exploring further. After the family had lived there for about a year, the Martins described a night that marked the beginning of the 13-day period later reported in interviews. It was Memorial Day weekend in late May, and a cold mist sat low over the field. Eric and Shelley stayed on the porch with their cups and the radio, looking out at the same view they had seen night after night. Shelley later said the normal night noise seemed missing, as if the field had gone still in a way she could feel. Eric said the absence of deer movement stood out to him, and he described it as a quiet that did not fit what he expected from that property. A rustle came from the field. Both of them looked toward the sound and saw reflective eyes in the fog. Eric told Shelley to aim the flashlight outward, and the beam caught more than the first glance suggested. Shelley later said she counted 5 sets of eyes watching from different points in the mist. The bodies behind the eyes were difficult to make out at that distance, but the shapes read as large and low, holding position rather than retreating. Eric said he did not recognize what he was looking at from the porch, only that the animals appeared bigger than coyotes he had seen in the area. They went inside and locked the door. Shelley tried to look out a window for a clearer view, then moved through the house checking each lock. Some windows were unsecured, and she closed and latched them. While moving room to room, she noticed the dogs were not in their usual places. She did not hear their tags, their pacing, or the sounds that normally followed them through the house. She called for them quietly and listened. At first, there was no response. A faint vibration and quick scurrying led her to a closet where both dogs were pressed together, trembling and silent. They were unharmed, and they remained huddled even after she found them. Eric chose a different approach. His truck was parked a short distance from the porch, roughly 30 to 40 feet from the door. In later descriptions, he said he believed he could reach the vehicle, back it close, and leave the property with Shelley, Chelsea, and the dogs. He took his keys, opened the door, and stepped into the driveway. He moved slowly because of his back injury, and each step took visible effort. As he reached the truck, a motion-activated light above it switched on, turning the driveway bright. He dropped the keys onto the ground near the driver's side. Bending to retrieve them was difficult for him, and he struggled to get down fast enough. Movement came forward from the fog. Eric later described a single animal breaking from the field and closing the distance toward the driveway. He said the outline looked wolf-like as it entered the brighter area near the truck. Before it reached him, it stopped and hesitated. Then it turned away and ran back into the mist. Eric returned to the house without the keys, and the door was secured again. A call to emergency services followed soon after. The Martins dialed 911 and described what they had seen outside. The dogs stayed hidden, and the house remained locked, while the field and tree line beyond the windows stayed quiet and hard to read. The first calls logged. The first call placed by the Martins came in late evening, after Eric returned to the house without his keys, and the dogs were found hiding in the closet. Shelley made the call while Eric stayed near the back windows, watching the field. The dispatcher logged the report as an animal disturbance, noting multiple large animals near a residence off Madawaska Road. The address was confirmed, and the call record reflected uncertainty about the species involved. The dispatcher advised the family to remain indoors, secure doors and windows, and avoid further contact with the animals. Local response that night was limited. An officer was not immediately dispatched to the property. The Martins were told to contact Maine State Police if the situation escalated. The field remained quiet for the rest of the night. Shelley stayed awake in the living room with the lights on, while Eric rested in a chair facing the porch door. Chelsea remained in her bedroom with the door closed. The dogs did not leave the closet until morning. The following day began without visible signs of activity. The fog had burned off by mid-morning, and the field showed no obvious disturbance from the porch. Eric walked the edge of the yard later that afternoon, moving carefully along the grass where the field met the tree line. He did not cross into the woods. He later described finding flattened grass in several places, pressed down in oval shapes that did not match deer bedding he was familiar with. No clear tracks were photographed or collected. Shelley called the local animal control officer that afternoon. The officer took notes and asked for descriptions of size, color, and behavior. Shelley described large, low-moving shapes with reflective eyes and a single animal that approached the driveway before turning away. The officer told her that coyotes were common in the area and that wolves were not officially documented in that part of Maine. The call ended with a recommendation to keep livestock secured and pets indoors. That evening, the Martins noticed movement again just after dusk. Eric was seated near the porch window, and Shelley was in the kitchen. The dogs paced the hallway but did not bark. Eric said he saw a shape move parallel to the tree line, keeping distance from the house. He described it as moving with purpose, not erratic or startled. Shelley did not see it directly, but she noted the dogs stopped pacing and stood still, ears forward, watching the same direction. Another call was made, this time to Maine State Police. The dispatcher asked whether the animals were threatening or attempting entry. Shelley reported that they were visible near the property, but not actively attacking the house. The dispatcher advised continued sheltering indoors and said patrol availability was limited. The call was logged as informational. Over the next 2 days, the Martins began keeping informal note. Shelley wrote down times when movement was seen and when sounds occurred. Eric marked locations along the field where shapes appeared at dusk or early morning. These notes were kept in a notebook on the kitchen table. No photographs were taken during this period, as the family did not attempt to go outside after dark. On the third day, Sean Martin returned to the property. He arrived in the afternoon and walked the perimeter with Eric while there was full daylight. Sean later said he noticed an absence of small animal activity, including birds and squirrels, near the tree line. He also described finding a section of fence near the back of the property where the wire had been pressed downward, as if something heavy had leaned or stepped against it. The fence was old and partially rusted, and no conclusion was made about when the damage occurred. That evening, Sean stayed for dinner. As night settled, all 3 adults watched from inside the house. Around the same time as previous sightings, movement appeared again at the edge of the field. Sean described seeing 2 shapes separated by several yards, both maintaining a steady distance from the house. No vocalizations were heard. The dogs retreated again, this time choosing a space under the dining table. A third call was placed that night, this time to the county sheriff's office. The The call record noted repeated sightings over multiple days. The dispatcher asked whether firearms were present in the home. Eric stated that he owned a rifle, but had not taken it outside. The dispatcher advised against confronting wildlife and repeated the instruction to stay indoors. No deputy was dispatched. By the 5th day, the pattern had become consistent. The Martins reported activity near dusk and again just before dawn. During daylight hours, the property appeared unchanged. Shelley drove to work and back without incident. Chelsea attended school and did not report seeing anything unusual from the bus. Eric remained home and avoided the yard unless necessary. On the 6th day, a neighbor from down the road stopped by after hearing about the situation. He had lived in the area for over 20 years and said he had seen large coyotes before, but nothing that lingered near a house for multiple nights. He walked part of the field with Eric and Sean and pointed out older deer trails that cut through the woods. He did not identify tracks that day and left before nightfall. The Martins made another call to animal control the following morning. Shelley reported the continued presence and the lack of response from other agencies. The officer said he would note the repeated reports but did not offer a timeline for an in-person visit. He repeated that wolves were not listed in the region and that unusual coyote behavior could not be ruled out. Throughout this period, the family did not experience damage to the house or attempts to enter it. Windows remained intact and doors were not tested. The animals stayed outside the immediate yard, maintaining a boundary near the field and tree line. The Martins' notes reflect that the animals never crossed into the open area directly beneath the porch light. By the end of the first week, the calls made by the family had been logged across multiple agencies, each categorized as wildlife-related and non-emergency. The Martins continued to remain indoors at night, documenting what they could without engaging directly, a pattern without contact. By the 7th day, the Martins no longer treated each night as a separate event. Shelley continued writing in the notebook on the kitchen table, adding times and short descriptions in neat, narrow handwriting. The entries became more regular, reflecting the way the activity appeared to follow a narrow window after sunset and another shortly before morning light. Eric reviewed the notes each afternoon and added his own observations in smaller print along the margins. No formal report was filed using these notes, but they remained central to how the family tracked what was happening outside. The first sighting of the 7th night occurred at 8:41 p.m. According to Shelley's record, the porch light was on, and the radio played at low volume in the living room. Eric was seated near the front window. He wrote that 2 shapes appeared near the tree line and remained visible for several minutes without advancing. Their movement was limited to small adjustments in position, as if shifting weight or turning slightly. They disappeared at 8:57 p.m. without sound. The following morning, Eric walked along the inner edge of the yard shortly after sunrise. He carried a walking stick to support his back and avoided stepping into the field. He noted 3 shallow depressions in the grass, spaced several feet apart, forming a loose arc facing the house. The grass was flattened but not torn. He did not attempt to measure them. Shelley photographed the area with a basic digital camera, but the images later showed only uneven grass and shadow. During the day, the household routine remained stable. Shelley drove to work at the same time each morning. Chelsea continued attending school and extracurricular activities. Eric stayed inside for most of the day and limited outdoor activity to brief periods. The dogs were kept indoors at all times and no longer waited by the door to be let out, even during daylight. On the 8th evening, visibility was clearer than previous nights. The air was dry and there was no fog over the field. Sean visited again and brought binoculars. He sat near the porch window and watched the tree line through the lenses. He later said that he could see body outlines more distinctly than before, including long backs and narrow heads. He did not observe visible markings or color patterns that he felt confident describing. The animals remained partially obscured by brush and did not enter open ground. That same night, Shelley recorded a low sound at approximately 10:12 p.m. She described it as a single, brief noise that did not match known dog or coyote calls she had heard before. It did not repeat. Eric did not hear it, and Sean said he noticed only a short pause in the animal's movement after the sound occurred. On the 9th day, Eric contacted a regional wildlife office and left a voicemail describing the ongoing situation. He included the number of days, the repeated sightings, and the lack of aggressive behavior. No return call was received that day. Shelley continued updating the notebook, adding short weather notes beside each entry, including temperature and cloud cover. The 10th night followed the established pattern. 3 shapes were visible at different times, between 8:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. Shelley noted that they never appeared simultaneously in the same position. When one moved closer to the edge of the field, another remained farther back. Eric described this as staggered spacing, though he did not attach meaning to it. The dogs remained under the dining table and did not vocalize. By the 11th day, fatigue became part of the household rhythm. Shelley began sleeping in short intervals on the couch, waking when sounds or movement caught her attention. Eric adjusted his chair closer to the window to reduce strain on his back. Chelsea limited her time in shared spaces during the evening and stayed in her room with headphones on. That afternoon, a state wildlife biologist returned Eric's earlier message. He asked several clarifying questions about size, behavior, and duration. Eric answered carefully, referring to the notebook where possible. The biologist said he could not confirm wolf presence in that region and suggested continued documentation. He did not schedule a visit. The 12th night was marked by closer proximity than previous evenings. At 9:03 p.m., Shelley wrote that one shape appeared several yards inside the usual boundary line. It remained visible for less than 2 minutes before retreating. No sound accompanied the movement. Eric said the posture appeared low and forward, but he did not observe raised fur, bared teeth, or other recognizable signs of aggression. On the morning of the 13th day, Shelley found new depressions in the grass closer to the porch than before. They were faint and partially obscured by dew. She photographed them and added a detailed entry to the notebook. Later that afternoon, she contacted animal control again and reported the continued presence and reduced distance. That evening, the family remained indoors with all lights on. Movement appeared later than usual, closer to 10 p.m., and lasted a shorter period. 2 shapes were seen near the tree line, remaining stationary before disappearing into the woods. Throughout this period, no direct contact occurred. The animals did not cross onto the porch, approach doors, or attempt entry. Their presence remained confined to the field and forest edge, forming a consistent but limited perimeter around the property. The night of closest distance. On the evening of the 6th of June 2006, Shelley Martin began her notebook entry earlier than usual. She wrote the date at the top of the page and noted clear skies and low wind. The temperature, taken from a radio weather report, was listed as 62 degrees. Eric had spent most of the afternoon resting in the living room, conserving energy, and Chelsea had returned from school and remained in her bedroom. The dogs stayed close to the hallway, moving little. By 7:30 p.m., the porch light was already on. The radio was off. Shelley later said the house felt unusually quiet, even before any movement was seen. Eric positioned his chair near the front window and rested his walking stick against the wall. He kept the binoculars Sean had left behind on the table beside him. At 8:12 p.m., Shelley recorded the first sighting. One shape appeared near the center-left section of the tree line, roughly aligned with a large maple at the edge of the field. Through the binoculars, Eric could see a long body outline and a narrow head profile. He said the animal was standing rather than crouching, with its weight evenly distributed. It remained visible for nearly 4 minutes without changing position. At 8:19 p.m., a second shape emerged farther to the right. Shelley wrote that the two appeared to face the house at slight angles, not directly aligned with each other. The spacing between them was estimated at 15 to 20 yards. Neither animal vocalized. The field remained still. At 8:27 p.m., the first animal moved forward. Shelley underlined this line in her notebook. She wrote that it crossed the usual boundary by several yards and entered the open grass. Eric followed the movement through the binoculars and described the gait as slow and deliberate. Each step appeared placed rather than rushed. He did not observe limping or irregular motion. The distance between the animal and the porch narrowed to approximately 60 feet, based on Eric's estimate using fence posts and known yard measurements. He said this placed the animal well inside any previous sighting range. Shelley turned off the kitchen light to reduce window glare and stood beside Eric. The dogs responded by retreating into the bathroom and pressing against the closed door. They remained silent. Chelsea emerged briefly from her room, observed the window, and returned without speaking. At 8:31 p.m., the second animal also advanced. It stopped closer to the tree line than the first, maintaining a wider gap. Shelley noted that the two did not move in parallel. One paused while the other continued, then reversed the pattern. This alternating movement continued for several minutes. Eric lifted the binoculars again and focused on the nearer animal. He later said he could see coarse fur texture and a long tail carried low. He did not see visible markings. The eyes reflected when caught by interior light, producing brief flashes. At 8:38 p.m., Shelley wrote that a third shape became visible farther back in the woods. It did not enter the field. It remained partially hidden behind brush and was visible only when it shifted position. During this period, no sound came from outside, no snapping branches, footsteps, or vocalizations were recorded. The only audible noise inside the house was the ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. Eric considered calling emergency services again, but decided to continue observing unless the animals approached further. Shelley held her phone in her hand during this time. She did not dial. At 8:44 p.m., the nearest animal stopped moving. It stood facing the house, body angled slightly to the left. Shelley later said this was the longest continuous stillness she had observed during the entire 13-day period. At 8:46 p.m., the animal turned and walked back toward the tree line. The second animal followed several seconds later. The third shape withdrew deeper into the woods and disappeared from view. By 8:52 p.m., no movement was visible. Shelley wrote "clear" at the bottom of the entry and added a note indicating no return before midnight. The family remained awake until after 1 a.m., checking the windows periodically. No further activity occurred that night. The following morning, Eric walked the yard boundary with Sean, who had arrived early. Near the center of the field, they found several flattened patches of grass aligned in a loose path toward the porch. The impressions were shallow and irregular. No distinct paw prints were visible. Sean took several photographs with his phone, though lighting conditions reduced clarity. Later that day, Eric contacted the wildlife office again and referenced the closer approach. He described the distance and timing using Shelley's notes. The staff member recorded the update and said it would be added to the existing file. No physical damage to the property was observed after the incident. The porch, siding, and doors showed no signs of contact. The animals did not return that evening. Aftermath without evidence. The morning after the 6th of June, 2006 began with routine activity. Shelley left for work at her usual time. Chelsea prepared for school without delay. Eric remained inside and reviewed the previous night's notebook entry several times. He added a brief margin note indicating the exact time of withdrawal and underlined the estimated distance again. The photographs taken by Sean were transferred to a home computer later that afternoon. They showed flattened grass and uneven lighting but no clear outlines. That same day, Eric visited the local town office in Palmyra to ask whether any wildlife complaints had been filed recently in the area. A clerk checked the records and told him that no similar reports had been logged that month. She suggested contacting the regional wildlife office directly. Eric returned home without filing a formal statement. Shelley called animal control again in the early evening. She reported the closer approach and the lack of physical evidence. The officer noted the update and asked whether livestock or pets had been harmed. Shelley said no. The officer said that without confirmed tracks, injuries, or property damage, the case would remain classified as observational. Over the next 2 days, the field remained undisturbed. Shelley's notebook entries shortened. Instead of detailed descriptions, she wrote brief notes such as "no movement" and "quiet night." Eric continued sitting near the front window during the evening hours, but did not use the binoculars. The dogs gradually returned to sleeping in their usual places, though they remained alert and avoided the porch door. On June 9, Eric received a short call from a state wildlife technician. The technician asked about the photographs and whether any samples had been collected. Eric said none had been taken. The technician explained that without physical material, further analysis was not possible. He suggested installing outdoor cameras if activity resumed. Chelsea returned from school that afternoon and mentioned that a classmate had asked about police cars near Madawaska Road. Shelley later clarified that a patrol vehicle had driven past the house twice earlier that week, but had not stopped. No officer had visited the property. On June 10, Sean visited again. He walked the perimeter with Eric and examined the fence and grass in stronger daylight. He said the flattened areas were fading and beginning to blend back into normal growth. He did not find new impressions. They marked 2 spots with small stones for reference and checked them the following day. No changes were observed. That weekend, a neighbor, Harold Wilkins, stopped by with his son. Wilkins had lived nearby for over 30 years and maintained hunting land farther north. He listened to the Martins' account and walked to the tree line with Eric. He pointed out several game trails and old bedding areas used by deer. He said some flattened patches resembled resting spots, but acknowledged that the spacing was unusual. He did not identify them as belonging to any specific species. Shelley continued maintaining the notebook even as activity declined. She added entries about weather patterns and moon phases, noting full and partial moonlight. She did not draw connections between these factors and the sightings. The notebook grew thicker, with loose photographs and printed call logs placed between pages. On June 12, Eric mailed copies of several photographs and handwritten entries to the regional wildlife office. He included a short cover letter summarizing the 13-day period and the closest approach. The envelope was sent from the local post office and arrived 3 days later, according to postal tracking. A brief response came the following week. The office acknowledged receipt and thanked him for the documentation. The letter stated that no verified wolf populations existed in that section of central Maine, and that large coyotes or transient animals could account for the observations. It did not request further information. By mid-June, nightly activity had ceased entirely. Shelley's entries recorded no sightings after June 8. The field returned to normal patterns of deer movement, visible at dusk and early morning. Birds returned to the tree line in greater numbers. Eric resumed short walks near the fence line during daylight. Despite the absence of continued activity, the family maintained their routines cautiously. Windows remained locked at night. Outdoor lights stayed on. The dogs were kept inside after sunset. No further calls were made to authorities during this period. The notebook was placed in a kitchen drawer and consulted less frequently. Shelley occasionally added retrospective notes when she remembered small details, such as specific cloud cover or wind direction. These were dated separately and marked as afterthoughts. No official investigation followed. No site visit was scheduled. No samples were collected. The incident remained categorized as an unresolved wildlife observation, with insufficient physical evidence, records, reports, and gaps. Shelley Martin reorganized the materials connected to the 13-day period and placed them in a single folder. The notebook, printed photographs, copies of phone records, and the letter from the regional wildlife office were arranged in chronological order. The folder was stored in a kitchen drawer alongside utility bills and insurance documents. Shelley later said she did this for practical reasons, in case another agency requested the information. No such request arrived during that summer. Eric kept a separate stack of papers in a small desk near the living room window. These included handwritten maps of the field, distances measured from the porch to fence posts, and a list of dates and times copied from Shelley's notebook. He occasionally reviewed these notes in the evenings, but did not add new material after mid-June. The desk drawer remained closed most of the time. In July, Eric contacted the wildlife office again by phone to confirm that his mailed materials had been logged. A staff member confirmed receipt and said they had been placed in an internal file connected to previous calls from the address. No file number was provided. The staff member said that unless new activity occurred, no further action would be taken. Shelley requested copies of the family's emergency call records through the local dispatch center. The request was processed under standard public records procedures. 2 weeks later, she received printed logs showing the dates, times, and brief summaries of the calls. The entries listed animal disturbance, wildlife concern, and multiple large animals near residents. No officer response times were included. Shelley added these pages to the folder. The call logs showed that 4 agencies had received reports: local police, Maine State Police, County Sheriff's Office, and Animal Control. Each entry was brief, usually no more than 2 lines. Descriptions were limited to large animals, possible coyotes, and unknown wildlife. None mentioned wolves by name. The logs did not include detailed descriptions given during the calls. In August, Sean Martin asked for copies of the photographs. Shelley made duplicates and mailed them to him. Sean stored them on his personal computer and later printed several for his own records. He did not submit them to any agency. During that summer, no further wildlife activity was reported on Madawaska Road. Neighboring properties did not file similar complaints. Eric asked 2 nearby residents informally whether they had noticed anything unusual. Both said they had not. One mentioned hearing coyotes occasionally at night, which he considered normal. In September, Shelley began teaching an evening class at a local community center. During casual conversation, she mentioned the incident to a colleague. The colleague suggested she speak with a local newspaper. Shelley declined. She later said she did not want attention or speculation and preferred to keep the matter within official channels. The folder remained untouched for several months. In December 2006, Eric reviewed it again after hearing a radio segment about wolf populations in northern Maine. The segment focused on Aroostook County and the Canadian border region. No reference was made to central Maine. Eric noted this in the margin of one of his papers, but did not contact the station. In early 2007, Eric filed a request with the State Wildlife Department for any public records related to reports from his address. The request was submitted by mail. 3 weeks later, he received a response stating that the department held limited information consisting of call summaries and correspondence. Copies were enclosed. These matched the material Shelley had already obtained, along with the acknowledgement letter from June. The department's internal notes, included in the response, consisted of short entries indicating report received, documentation reviewed, and no confirmed species. No site visits, field inspections, or follow-up actions were listed. The dates matched the period from late May to mid-June. Shelley compared these internal notes with her notebook. She noticed that several nights with recorded sightings did not appear in any agency record. Only the nights when phone calls were made were documented. Nights with activity that the family chose not to report were absent from official files. In March 2007, a wildlife graduate student from the University of Maine contacted the regional office requesting access to public records related to unusual animal behavior. The office informed Eric of the request and asked whether he consented to his materials being shared. He agreed. The student received copies of the same documents Eric had. The student later sent Eric a brief email thanking him for the cooperation. The email stated that the case would be included in a broader dataset examining rural wildlife encounters. During 2007 and 2008, the Martins did not revisit the material often. Life routines resumed. Shelley changed jobs. Chelsea graduated from high school. Eric continued managing his injury and remained mostly at home. The folder remained in the drawer. In 2009, a local outdoors magazine published an article on coyote behavior in central Maine. The article mentioned several anecdotal reports of bold or persistent animals near homes. It did not reference the Martins. Eric read the article and noted similarities in timing and location, but did not contact the publisher. That same year, Sean moved out of state. He kept his copies of the photographs and notes. During a family visit, he discussed the incident with relatives. Some asked whether official explanations had been provided. Eric said none had. In 2011, Shelley reorganized household paperwork and transferred older documents into labeled storage boxes. The folder was placed in a box marked 2005-2008. It was stored in the basement. Moisture damage was avoided, and the contents remained intact. In 2013, a television production company researching unusual wildlife encounters contacted the regional wildlife office. The office referred them to publicly available records. The Martins case was among those included. A researcher later contacted Eric by phone and asked for an interview. Eric declined. He said he did not want the events presented in an exaggerated way. The researcher requested copies of the notebook and photographs. She later said she felt the documentation had already been reviewed by appropriate agencies and did not want it repurposed for entertainment. In 2015, Eric reviewed the documents again while assisting Chelsea with a college research project on record keeping. He showed her how official and personal records could differ. Chelsea noticed that some dates in the call logs were rounded to the nearest hour, while Shelley's notebook recorded exact minutes. She pointed this out, and Shelley added a note to the folder describing the discrepancy. That same year, Eric requested updated information from the wildlife department regarding wolf populations. He received a general pamphlet and a link to online resources. None referenced confirmed populations in central Maine. In 2017, a regional historical society began collecting oral histories from long-term residents. Shelley participated in an interview about rural life and commuting patterns. She briefly mentioned the 2006 incident when asked about notable experiences. The interviewer recorded the statement, but did not pursue further detail. The Historical Society's transcript included one paragraph summarizing her account. It referred to repeated sightings of large animals near the home and unresolved wildlife concerns. No species was identified. Shelley later requested a copy and placed it in the storage box. In 2019, Eric's health declined, and he reduced his activity further. The desk where he kept his notes was cleared, and many papers were discarded. The field maps and distance measurements were kept, as Shelley moved them into the same box as the main folder. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Shelley reorganized the basement while spending more time at home. She reviewed the box and reread the documents. She noticed fading ink in some notebook entries and scanned several pages for digital backup. These files were saved on a home computer. In 2021, a local blogger wrote about unexplained wildlife encounters in Maine and referenced publicly available dispatch records. The blogger listed the Martins' address among several others. The post did not include names. Shelley became aware of it through a friend. She did not contact the blogger. In response, Eric submitted a brief clarification comment stating that the family had cooperated with authorities and that no conclusions had been reached. The comment was posted without further discussion. In 2022, Sean requested digital copies of the scanned pages. Shelley emailed them to him. Sean stored them in cloud storage and labeled the folder with the dates. Later that year, the Wildlife Department updated its public database. Older call records were archived, and some details were condensed. Shelley checked the online entries and found that several of the Martins' calls were now grouped into a single summary entry. Individual timestamps were no longer visible. She contacted the department and asked about the change. A staff member explained that older records were periodically consolidated for administrative purposes. Original records remained in internal archives but were not publicly displayed. Shelley noted this change in a new document and printed a copy of the email exchange. It was added to the storage box. By 2023, most references to the incident existed only in private documents, archived records, and informal online mentions. No official review had been reopened. No additional evidence had surfaced. The Martins' materials reflected multiple layers of record-keeping. Personal notes recorded minute details and subjective impressions. Agency logs summarized events in brief categories. Correspondence acknowledged receipt without interpretation. Later, archival practices reduced visible detail. Comparisons between these sources showed consistent dates and general descriptions but differed in precision. Times recorded in the notebook often included minutes, while official logs used broader ranges. Descriptions in personal notes were longer and more specific, while agency summaries used standardized language. Some gaps were also apparent. Several nights with documented sightings were not represented in any public record. No photographs were formally catalogued by agencies. No site inspections were listed. No physical samples were collected. These gaps reflected the way the case had been classified from the beginning. Without injury, property damage, or confirmed species identification, the reports remained observational. The classification limited the level of documentation required. Shelley maintained that the records were complete to the best of their ability. She did not attempt to reconstruct missing information. Eric expressed a similar view in later conversations. He said that the documentation reflected what was available at the time. He did not believe additional records existed elsewhere. The storage box remains in the basement of the Martins' home. It contains the original notebook, copies of call logs, photographs, correspondence, transcripts, and later emails. Digital scans exist on 2 computers and 1 cloud account. Witnesses beyond the household. Most people living near Madawaska Road in 2006 kept irregular schedules shaped by farming, seasonal work, and long commutes. Mornings often began before sunrise, and evenings ended early. Because of this, activity after dark went largely unwitnessed by anyone outside individual households. The 13-day period described by the Martins unfolded during hours when nearby residents were usually indoors. As a result, outside observations came mostly from daytime encounters, routine visits, and later recollections rather than direct nighttime sightings. The nearest neighboring residence to the Martins' home was located approximately half a mile south along Madawaska Road. It was occupied by Harold Wilkins and his wife, Margaret. At the time, Wilkins was semi-retired and spent most mornings maintaining his property and checking nearby wooded areas for fallen branches and fencing damage. During an interview conducted in 2017 for a regional historical society project, Wilkins stated that he had not personally seen large animals near the Martins' field in 2006. He did recall noticing reduced deer activity that spring. He said that by late May, deer that normally crossed his land at dusk had shifted farther north. Wilkins also recalled that several nights during that period were unusually quiet. He described evenings with no barking, no howling, no usual noise. He did not attach significance to this at the time and attributed it to changing weather patterns. Margaret Wilkins reported similar observations. In a written statement added to the Historical Society archive, she said that she remembered Shelley mentioning strange animals during a brief roadside conversation in early June. Margaret said she did not see the animals herself and assumed they were coyotes. Approximately 1 mile east of the Martins' property lived Robert and Elaine Patterson, who owned a small cattle operation. Their land bordered a section of mixed forest connected to the Martins' tree line. In June 2006, the Pattersons reported no livestock losses. However, Robert Patterson later told a local reporter that several calves had refused to graze near the wooded edge for several weeks that summer. He said the animals clustered closer to the barn than usual and avoided one pasture entirely. Elaine Patterson kept feeding and veterinary logs for their cattle. A review of these records in 2010 showed no documented illnesses or injuries during the relevant period. However, she had written several notes about skittish behavior and restless movement in late May and early June. No explanation was recorded. Another nearby resident, Thomas Riley, owned seasonal hunting land north of Palmyra. He He visited the property in early June 2006 to prepare tree stands and clear brush. In an email sent to Eric Martin in 2009, Riley said he had noticed heavy game movement deeper in the woods and fewer signs near the road. He described finding several well-used deer trails that appeared recently abandoned. He did not see large predators during his visits. Riley also mentioned that he found several clusters of flattened grass near the edge of his land. At the time, he assumed they were deer bedding sites. He later reconsidered after hearing about the Martins' experience, but did not revise his original notes. During the first week of June, Sean Martin visited the property several times. His observations were recorded in Shelley's notebook, and later in his own notes, Sean stated that he noticed reduced bird activity near the tree line. He said that songbirds that usually gathered in the early morning were largely absent for several days. This observation was included in his personal records, but not reported to authorities. Chelsea Martin's boyfriend, Nate Turner, also provided informal testimony in a written statement prepared in 2012 for a college project. Turner described the earlier discovery of the circular ground opening and his later visits during the 13-day period. He said he never saw the animals directly, but noticed that the dogs refused to approach certain parts of the yard, even during daylight. He described this behavior as consistent throughout early June. Turner also reported hearing a single unfamiliar sound one evening while sitting on the porch with Chelsea around 9:30 p.m. He described it as low and short, and said it did not repeat. Shelley did not record this in her notebook, as she was inside at the time. Several delivery drivers also visited the area during this period. Postal records indicate that regular mail delivery occurred each weekday morning. The assigned carrier, David Holloway, later stated that he did not notice anything unusual at the Martins' property. He did recall that the dogs, normally visible near the porch, were not outside for several weeks. A propane delivery was made on the 3rd of June 2006. The driver, Mark Ellis, signed a standard delivery form indicating no access issues. In a follow-up inquiry conducted in 2014, Ellis stated that he remembered the delivery because Shelley asked him to remain near the truck while she retrieved paperwork. He said she mentioned wild animals, but did not provide details. Ellis did not see anything unusual in the field. A utility technician from Central Maine Power visited the area on June 5 to inspect a line following a brief outage. The technician, Samuel Ortiz, walked along part of the tree line. His work report noted heavy brush and animal paths, but did not specify species. In a later interview, Ortiz said he had seen similar trails throughout rural Maine and did not find them noteworthy. School bus driver Linda Carver transported Chelsea and other students along Madawaska Road during this period. In a 2011 interview with a local newspaper, Carver said she never saw animals near the Martins' driveway. She did mention that several mornings felt empty, with fewer visible deer along the route. Local hunter Daniel Prescott also provided an account in 2008. Prescott had scouted land near Palmyra in June 2006 and told a wildlife officer that he observed fewer signs of small game. He did not see large predators, but noted that rabbit and squirrel activity appeared reduced. His statement was included in a broader wildlife survey. None of these external witnesses reported seeing wolf-like animals directly on the Martins' property during the 13 days. Their accounts focused on secondary observations, including changes in wildlife behavior, reduced activity, and environmental quiet. When these statements were later reviewed together, they showed overlapping timelines. Reduced deer movement, altered livestock behavior, and decreased bird activity were reported independently by multiple individuals. However, none of these observations were formally linked in official records. The Wildlife Department did not conduct a coordinated survey using these accounts. Each statement remained separate within individual files, interviews, or private correspondence. No consolidated witness report was created. In later years, some residents discussed the incident informally at community gatherings. These conversations were not recorded. Accounts varied in detail depending on memory and retelling. Some residents recalled hearing about wolves. Others remembered only that the Martins had animal trouble. Shelley and Eric did not actively solicit outside testimony. They relied primarily on their own records and official channels. When approached by neighbors or acquaintances, they answered questions but did not collect written statements. As a result, external observations remained fragmented. They existed as personal memories, scattered documents, and brief mentions in unrelated records. No unified narrative was assembled from these sources during or after the event. Official assessments and limitations. When the first reports from the Martins reached public offices in late May and early June of 2006, They entered systems designed primarily for routine service calls and regulatory tracking. Each call was processed through standardized intake forms, translated into brief codes, and stored within separate administrative structures. The information was reduced to short summaries before any broader review could occur, shaping how the situation was understood from the beginning. By mid-June of 2006, the Martins reports had been logged by multiple agencies, including local police, animal control, county sheriff's office, and the regional wildlife department. Each agency maintained its own record system. No single office assumed primary responsibility for reviewing the case in full. Instead, the reports remained distributed across separate databases and paper files. The earliest assessments were made by dispatchers who categorized incoming calls based on standard criteria. These categories included animal disturbance, wildlife concern, and possible coyote activity. The selection of these labels depended on the information provided during each call and the thus absence of confirmed threats or injuries. Once entered, these categories shaped how the reports were routed and reviewed. Local police records from May and June 2006 show that the Martins' calls were classified as non-emergency. The entries noted multiple animals near a residence but did not indicate aggressive behavior. Because no property damage or physical danger was reported, patrol officers were not assigned to conduct site visits. The reports were closed after each call. Animal control records followed a similar pattern. The officer assigned to the area recorded descriptions provided by Shelley and Eric and noted that coyotes were common in central Maine. Internal notes referenced the lack of visible tracks or injured animals. Without physical evidence, no field inspection was scheduled. The Maine State Police logged 2 informational calls from the Martins. These entries summarized the situation in brief language and indicated that the family had been advised to remain indoors. No follow-up actions were listed. According to departmental policy at the time, wildlife-related calls without immediate safety risks were not prioritized for on-site response. The Regional Wildlife Department received documentation by mail in June 2006. This included photographs, written notes, and a cover letter from Eric. The materials were reviewed by administrative staff and a wildlife technician. Internal comments, later released through public records requests, stated that the case involved unconfirmed large canids and no verified presence of wolves. The department's evaluation relied on existing population data. In 2006, confirmed grey wolf populations in Maine were limited to far northern regions near the Canadian border. No established packs were documented in central counties. This information formed the basis for the department's conclusion that wolves were unlikely to be involved. Field investigations were typically reserved for cases involving livestock losses, human injury, or verified endangered species. The Martins' case did not meet these thresholds. As a result, no biologist or conservation officer visited the property during or after the 13-day period. Officials also considered the possibility of large coyotes or coy dog hybrids. Internal notes reference studies showing that eastern coyotes often grow larger than their western counterparts. These animals sometimes display bold behavior near human residences, particularly during late spring and early summer. No specific determination was recorded in the Martins' file. The absence of physical samples limited further analysis. No hair, scat, tracks, or tissue was collected. Photographs showed flattened grass but lacked scale markers or clear impressions. Without such material, laboratory testing was not possible. Communication between agencies was minimal. Each office maintained its own file. There was no centralized case review or interdepartmental meeting regarding the reports. Updates were shared informally when requested, but were not systematically coordinated. In a response letter sent to Eric in June 2006, the Wildlife Department stated that the documentation had been reviewed and added to internal records. The letter did not offer an explanation beyond noting the lack of confirmed wolf populations. It encouraged continued reporting if activity resumed. During a follow-up call in 2007, a wildlife technician explained that many rural wildlife encounters remain unresolved. He said that without clear evidence, agencies are limited to classification and documentation. No additional guidance was provided. Budget and staffing constraints also affected response capacity. At the time, the Regional Wildlife Office served multiple counties with a small number of field officers. Priority was given to cases involving injured animals, hunting violations, and public safety emergencies. Routine observation reports received lower attention. Training materials used by dispatchers and officers emphasized caution in identifying species based solely on eyewitness accounts. Employees were instructed to avoid confirming species without physical verification. This policy influenced how the Martins' descriptions were recorded and summarized. The department's internal database included a short summary of the case. It listed dates, general location, and category. Detailed personal notes and photographs were stored separately and were not digitized. Access to these materials required specific requests. When later inquiries were made by researchers and media representatives, agencies relied primarily on these summary entries. The condensed format limited the amount of contextual information available to outside reviewers. No environmental survey of the area was conducted in relation to the case. Vegetation, prey populations, and predator activity were not formally assessed. Any changes in wildlife behavior observed by neighbors remained outside official monitoring programs. Officials also noted that seasonal patterns could affect animal movement. Late May and early June coincide with breeding and rearing periods for many species. This information was referenced in general correspondence but not applied directly to the Martins case. In internal correspondence from 2008, a supervisor wrote that the file required no further action unless new incidents occur. This notation effectively closed active review. The case remained archived but inactive. From the perspective of the agencies involved, the incident fit within a broader category of unverified wildlife encounters. Such cases were considered common in rural regions and were rarely reopened without new evidence. Shelley and Eric were informed of these limitations through letters and phone conversations. They were told that their reports had been taken seriously but that no conclusions could be drawn. Neither was offered an opportunity for formal review or appeal. The official assessments, therefore, consisted of brief classifications, population references, and procedural closures. They reflected institutional standards focused on verifiable data and resource management rather than prolonged observation cases. These limitations shaped how the Martins' experience entered public and administrative records. The event remained documented but unresolved, constrained by the absence of physical proof and the boundaries of agency protocols. Daily life under observation. By the time the sightings entered their second week, the Martins no longer experienced them as isolated nighttime events. The presence near the field had become a factor woven into ordinary planning, affecting when tasks were done and where family members positioned themselves inside the house. Without formal discussion, the household began organizing each day around periods of visibility and uncertainty. Shelley began waking earlier than usual in the mornings. She prepared for work quietly and avoided turning on unnecessary lights. She later said that she preferred to leave the house before sunrise, when the field was still empty and visibility was clear. Her departure times became more consistent, and she stopped lingering in the driveway before leaving. Eric altered his schedule more noticeably. Before the sightings, he often spent time outdoors in the late afternoon, sitting on the porch or walking along the fence line. During the 13-day period, he limited outdoor activity to early morning and midday hours. He avoided being outside near dusk. His chair was moved closer to the front window so he could observe the field without standing. Chelsea adjusted her behavior in smaller ways. She stopped using headphones in shared areas at night and kept her bedroom door closed more often. She did not invite friends over during the period. She later said she preferred not to explain the situation and wanted to keep evenings quiet. The dogs' routines changed almost immediately. Prior to the sightings, they were regularly let into the yard in the evening. During the 13 days, they were kept indoors after sunset. They were taken outside only in the early morning and under supervision. Shelley recorded several instances in which the dogs hesitated before going out, even during daylight. Meal times shifted slightly. Dinner was prepared earlier and finished before dark when possible. The family spent evenings in the living room, rather than moving between rooms. Curtains and blinds were kept partially closed after sunset to reduce glare and improve visibility outside. Lighting patterns inside the house changed. Porch lights remained on throughout the night. Interior lights were used selectively. Shelley often turned off kitchen and hallway lights while Eric observed through the front window. This practice became routine after the closest approach on June 6. Sleeping arrangements were also modified. Shelley slept on the couch on several nights to remain near the front of the house. Eric remained in a reclining chair rather than his bed during periods of activity. Chelsea stayed in her room with the door closed. These arrangements were informal and changed depending on fatigue. Household noise levels decreased. The radio, which had previously played in the evenings, was often turned off. Television volume was kept low. Conversations were quieter and shorter. Shelley later said this was partly due to tiredness and partly due to a desire to listen for outside sounds. Eric developed a pattern of checking windows and doors before sitting down in the evening. He tested locks, inspected frames, and confirmed that curtains were positioned correctly. This routine was repeated nightly and became automatic by the end of the first week. Shelley maintained the notebook during this period and kept it within reach. She recorded sightings, weather, and times, but she also wrote brief notes about sleep, work schedules, and household tasks. These entries showed that daily responsibilities continued alongside the observations. Despite the changes, basic routines remained intact. Shelley continued working full-time. Chelsea attended school regularly. Eric handled household maintenance as he was able. No extended leave or external assistance was requested. Social activity declined temporarily. Phone calls with friends were shorter. Weekend visits were postponed. Sean's visits were limited to daylight hours. The family did not host gatherings or invite guests during the period. Errands were planned more carefully. Grocery shopping and appointments were scheduled earlier in the day. Shelley avoided returning home after dark when possible. Eric did not travel far from the house. Personal habits were also affected. Shelley drank more coffee during the day to compensate for reduced sleep. Eric adjusted his medication schedule slightly after consulting his doctor due to fatigue. Chelsea spent more time studying in her room. The family developed informal signals to communicate observations. Shelley would write short notes in the notebook and place it on the table. This system reduced the need for extended discussion at night. Emotional responses were not openly discussed during the period. Shelley later said that she avoided expressing concern in front of Chelsea. Eric focused on practical tasks. Chelsea did not ask detailed questions. Conversations centered on schedules and routines. By the second week, these adjustments had stabilized. Evenings followed a predictable pattern. Lights were arranged, windows checked, and observation periods established without discussion. The process required little coordination. After activity declined, some routines gradually returned to normal. The dogs were allowed outside in the evening again. Shelley resumed sleeping in her bedroom. The radio was turned on at low volume. However, some habits, such as checking locks and keeping porch lights on, continued long afterward. Shelley's notebook includes several entries from late June noting routine normal and quiet evening. These entries reflect the gradual easing of restrictions rather than a sudden change. In later interviews, Shelley and Eric described the period as physically tiring but logistically manageable. They said that most adjustments involved timing rather than major lifestyle changes. No professional counseling or outside support was sought. The family did not report long-term disruption to work or education. The changes remained temporary and informal. The 13-day period was marked by increased awareness of surroundings and closer attention to routine activities. Ordinary tasks were completed with added caution. These adjustments formed a quiet background to the documented sightings, public attention, and private silence. In the months following June 2006, information about the Martins' experience circulated slowly and unevenly. There was no immediate media coverage. No official press release was issued. The incident entered public awareness through informal conversation rather than published reports. Most references appeared first in private exchanges between neighbors, co-workers, and extended family members. Shelley returned to her regular work schedule after the activity ended. In the workplace, she did not volunteer details about the 13-day period. When asked why she seemed tired during early June, she replied that she had not been sleeping well. Only a small number of colleagues were told about the animals near the house, and those conversations were brief. Shelley later said she did not want the situation to become a topic of speculation. Eric adopted a similar approach. He continued interacting with neighbors and acquaintances in Palmyra and Pittsfield without raising the subject. When others mentioned hearing about something strange near Madawaska Road, he acknowledged that animals had been seen but did not expand on the details. He avoided using descriptive language that might invite further questions. Chelsea's school environment produced limited discussion. A few classmates asked whether police had been at her house. She responded that there had been wildlife concerns and changed the subject. No teachers or administrators contacted the family. The matter did not become part of school records. Sean discussed the incident more openly within the extended family. During gatherings in late 2006 and early 2007, he described the sightings and the closest approach. These accounts were shared verbally and were not written down. Relatives who heard the story sometimes repeated it to others, usually in simplified form. By early 2007, several versions of the event were circulating informally. Some described wolves near a farmhouse. Others referred to large coyotes. A few mentioned strange lights and animals, combining separate elements of earlier observations. These variations reflected the way information changed through retelling. Local community spaces also played a role. Conversations at the post office, hardware store, and gas station occasionally included references to the Martins' property. These exchanges were short and lacked consistent detail. In September 2006, Shelley's colleague suggested contacting a newspaper. Shelley declined. She later explained that she was concerned about exaggerated reporting and online attention. She preferred to rely on official documentation rather than public exposure. Eric shared this concern. He had observed how minor local incidents sometimes became distorted when reported. He believed that public attention would not lead to additional investigation and might create pressure to speculate. For this reason, he declined later interview requests. The first indirect media reference appeared in 2009 when a regional outdoors magazine published an article on eastern coyote behavior. The article included a brief mention of multiple reports of persistent animals near residences in central Maine during 2006. No addresses or names were given. The Martins were not contacted. In 2011, a local newspaper ran a short feature on unusual wildlife encounters. The article cited public dispatch records and included one paragraph about repeated calls from a rural address on Madawaska Road. Again, no names were published. Shelley recognized the reference but did not respond. Online discussion developed later. Between 2014 and 2016, several blogs and forums focused on unexplained animal encounters in New England. Some users cited publicly available records from Palmyra. Others referenced second-hand stories. A few posts included incorrect dates or locations. Shelley became aware of these discussions through friends. She did not participate. Eric posted one brief clarification comment in 2021, stating that the family had cooperated with authorities and that no conclusions had been reached. He did not engage further. Television production companies contacted the Wildlife Department in 2013 and again in 2018, seeking material for programs about unexplained phenomena. Public records were provided. When researchers reached out to the Martins, both Eric and Shelley declined interviews. No filming occurred at the property. The family's decision to limit public involvement was consistent over time. They responded to official requests but avoided media appearances. They did not attend conferences, speak at events, or submit articles. Their documentation remained private. Within the community, this restraint affected how the incident was remembered. Without public statements, there was no authoritative narrative beyond agency summaries. Informal versions continued to circulate without correction. Some neighbors interpreted the family's silence as evidence that the matter had been resolved. Others assumed that authorities had provided explanations privately. In reality, no additional information had been given. Shelley occasionally discussed the event with close friends. These conversations focused on practical aspects, such as lack of sleep and documentation efforts. She avoided discussing interpretations or theories. Eric did the same with a small group of acquaintances. In 2017, Shelley's participation in an oral history project created a limited public record. Her statement was factual and brief. It was archived and not widely distributed. Few community members were aware of it. By the early 2020s, references to the incident appeared mainly in online compilations of unusual wildlife reports. These lists drew from dispatch records and older articles. The Martins' experience was usually summarized in 1 or 2 sentences. None of these summaries included the full notebook records or personal correspondence. As a result, most public references lacked context and detail. The family did not attempt to correct or expand these accounts. They maintained that the official records and their own files were sufficient. They did not see public attention as necessary for resolution. This approach shaped how the event existed in public memory. It remained present but undefined, known in fragments rather than as a complete account. Public awareness of the 13-day period developed slowly, remained limited, and never became centralized. Private documentation continued to contain the most detailed record. The Martins' silence was not absolute. They cooperated with researchers and officials when asked. Their experience remained largely confined to personal records and administrative files. Later reinterpretations and retrospective accounts. References to the Martins' 13-day experience had shifted away from immediate reporting and toward archival and research contexts. The incident was no longer treated as a current concern, but as a historical entry within broader collections of rural wildlife encounters. This change altered how the material was accessed, discussed, and summarized in later years. The first formal retrospective inquiry occurred in 2009, when a graduate student studying rural wildlife encounters contacted Eric by email. The student requested permission to review the notebook and photographs. Eric provided copies of selected pages and digital images. The student later cited the case in a thesis appendix as an example of unverified extended wildlife presence. No further interpretation was offered. In 2011, Shelley participated in a structured interview for a regional oral history project. The interview focused primarily on employment patterns and commuting life in central Maine. When asked about notable personal experiences, Shelley briefly mentioned the 13-day period. She referred to her notes and avoided describing details from memory. The transcript recorded dates and general observations without elaboration. During this period, Sean shared his recollections with several acquaintances who were involved in outdoor recreation and wildlife tracking. In 2012, one of these individuals encouraged him to submit a written account to a regional conservation newsletter. Sean declined. He later stated that he did not feel confident adding interpretation beyond what had been recorded. Chelsea addressed the incident in a college research paper in 2013 that examined household responses to perceived environmental risk. She cited her family's documentation and included short excerpts from Shelley's notebook. The paper focused on behavioral adaptation rather than species identification. It was archived in the university library and was not widely circulated. Between 2014 and 2016, online forums and blogs began compiling lists of unexplained wildlife reports in New England. Several of these sources referenced the Martins case using dispatch logs and secondhand summaries. Dates and durations were sometimes incorrect. In some posts, the 13-day period was shortened or extended. Shelley noted these discrepancies, but did not contact the authors. In 2015, Eric was interviewed by a local environmental studies class conducting fieldwork on community reporting practices. The interview was recorded and transcribed. Eric relied heavily on the original notes during the discussion. He corrected the interviewer when approximate dates were used instead of specific ones. The transcript emphasized the limits of available evidence. That same year, a retired wildlife officer reviewed several archived cases for a training seminar. The Martins file was included as an example of incomplete documentation. The officer noted that repeated sightings without physical evidence presented challenges for field response. No new analysis was added. In 2017, a small research group studying eastern canid populations requested access to historical reports from central Maine. The Wildlife Department shared anonymized summaries, including the Martins case. The researchers categorized it as a persistent proximity report. Their published paper listed the case in a data table without narrative description. Shelley was contacted in 2018 by a documentary researcher preparing background material for a program on unusual animal behavior. She declined to participate but confirmed basic dates and locations. The researcher later relied on public records and did not include the case prominently. As public interest in regional wildlife patterns increased in the late 2010s, older reports were re-examined. Some writers compared the Martins' experience with later incidents involving bold coyotes and hybrid canids. These comparisons were based on timing and geography rather than direct evidence. In 2020, Shelley digitized most of the notebook pages and stored them on a home computer. She also created labeled folders containing correspondence and photographs. This process involved reviewing each entry. She later said that the written notes felt more precise than her own recollections. During this period, Eric noticed that his memory of specific nights had become less detailed. He relied increasingly on written records rather than personal recall. In conversations with family members, he deferred to the notebook when dates or sequences were discussed. In 2021, a local journalist preparing a retrospective article on rural emergency reporting practices contacted the Martins. They provided copies of call logs and correspondence. The resulting article discussed administrative procedures and mentioned the 13-day period as one example. It did not analyze the sightings themselves. Several wildlife biology textbooks published after 2020 included brief references to prolonged non-aggressive predator presence near residences. These references cited multiple cases, including anonymized records from Maine. The Martins' experience was incorporated indirectly into these summaries. By 2022, the case appeared in several online databases that compiled historical wildlife reports. These entries listed dates, location, and classification. None included primary documents. Some databases used simplified descriptions that omitted contextual details. In family discussions, the incident was sometimes revisited when related topics arose. These conversations were factual and brief. The family rarely speculated. They focused on what had been written rather than what was remembered. Shelley continued updating her records when new references appeared. She printed relevant articles and placed them in the storage box. Each edition was dated. This process created a layered archive combining original and later materials. Eric expressed concern in later years that secondary sources sometimes overstated elements of the case. He pointed out instances where wolf-like was presented as wolf or where unconfirmed was omitted. He did not pursue formal corrections. No later reinterpretation resulted in official reclassification. The Wildlife Department maintained its original position. The case remained listed as unverified and observational. Academic and media references continued to rely on the same limited evidence. No new physical material emerged. No additional witnesses came forward. Over time, the incident became framed less as an isolated event and more as part of a pattern of rural wildlife encounters. This shift reflected broader research trends rather than new findings related to the martens. The retrospective record shows gradual layering of interpretation without substantial change in underlying data. Each later account drew from the same original sources, filtered through different institutional and personal contexts. What remains documented, long after the activity near the field had ended, the martens' experience continued to exist, mainly through written and recorded material, rather than ongoing investigation. Over time, these materials became separated across personal storage, institutional archives, and digital systems. Each location preserved only part of the original record, leaving no single, complete account in one place. The original notebook remained the central document. It was kept in a labeled storage box in the basement, placed inside a plastic sleeve to protect it from moisture. The pages showed signs of age. Ink had faded slightly in places. Some corners were bent from repeated handling. The handwriting remained legible. Dates, times, and short descriptions filled most of the pages, written in consistent style. Alongside the notebook were printed call logs, letters from the Wildlife Department, and copies of photographs. These documents were arranged in chronological order. Shelley maintained this arrangement during periodic reviews. She did not reorganize the material after 2020, stating that the original order reflected how events had unfolded. Digital copies existed on 2 household computers and in a cloud storage account shared between Shelley and Sean. These files included scanned notebook pages, photographs, and correspondence. File names followed a simple structure using dates and brief descriptions. No additional annotations were added. The Wildlife Department retained its internal records in archived format. These consisted mainly of summary entries and scanned correspondence. Detailed handwritten notes and photographs submitted by Eric were stored separately in physical files. Access required formal requests and approval. Emergency dispatch records were preserved in municipal and state databases. Over time, these entries were condensed and grouped. Earlier versions showing individual timestamps were no longer visible in public-facing systems. Original logs remained in long-term storage. Academic references to the case appeared in limited context. University libraries retained Chelsea's paper and the graduate student thesis that cited the incident. Research datasets contained anonymized summaries. These materials were not cross-linked. Media archives contained brief references in regional publications and online articles. Most consisted of short paragraphs or lists. None included primary documentation. Some contained minor errors in dates or duration. Within the household, the materials were consulted infrequently. Shelley reviewed them occasionally when reorganizing storage or responding to inquiries. Eric relied on them when discussing the event with family members. Sean maintained his own digital archive but did not update it. No additional physical evidence had ever been added. No biological samples, verified tracks, or confirmed photographs were included in the record. The documentation remained observational and descriptive. The property itself showed no lasting markers. The field had been plowed and reseeded several times since 2006. Fence sections had been replaced. Trees along the tree line had grown and shifted. No visible features corresponded to the locations recorded in the notebook. Weather records from the period remained accessible through public databases. These confirmed temperature, precipitation, and visibility conditions noted by Shelley. They matched most of her entries within narrow margins. Regional wildlife population data had been updated repeatedly over the years. None indicated established wolf populations in central Maine. Reports of large eastern coyotes and hybrid canids increased in frequency. These trends were documented independently of the Martins case. The family's correspondence with agencies ended in 2008. No further official communication occurred. Later references relied on archive material. When asked in later years whether they wished for additional investigation, Shelley said that the existing records represented what had been possible at the time. Eric stated that he did not expect further clarification without new evidence. Neither pursued reopening the case. The incident remained categorized as unresolved and unverified. This classification did not change. It appeared consistently in agency summaries and research databases. The documentation reflected multiple perspectives. Personal notes recorded immediate observations. Dispatch logs captured institutional responses. Academic references abstracted the information into datasets. Media sources simplified it for public audiences. Each layer reduced detail. No comprehensive synthesis had ever been produced. The records remained distributed across personal, administrative, and archival systems. Their contents overlapped but were not identical. Over time, the written material became more prominent than memory. Family members increasingly relied on the notebook rather than personal recall. Dates, distances, and sequences were referenced from the pages. The storage box remained in the same basement location. It contained the original notebook, letters, photographs, transcripts, and printed emails. A small label on the lid read, 2006 field. The digital files were backed up annually. Shelley maintained this routine after noticing fading ink in the notebook. The backups were stored on external drives and cloud servers. No public repository included the complete collection. No institution had requested permanent custody. The materials remained private. The 13-day period continued to exist primarily through these documents. They preserved what was observed, what was reported, and how it was recorded. They did not provide explanations. The record consisted of times, distances, descriptions, and administrative notes. It showed when activity appeared and when it stopped. It showed how agencies responded and how the family adjusted. It did not extend beyond those boundaries. What remains is a set of preserved observations. They reflect a specific place, a limited span of days, and the methods available to record them. They have not changed since they were created. If you found this video interesting, subscribe for more videos like this. Leave a comment with your thoughts and share this video to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.